Eric had always preferred the solitude of night shifts. As a security guard, he found comfort in the quiet and stillness of places that others found eerie. The sprawling construction site of the luxury Blackstone Hotel was no exception. It was a mess of steel beams, half-built walls, and construction equipment. By day, it was chaotic and bustling with workers. By night, it was a dark, silent labyrinth. On this particular evening, Eric's routine patrol led him to the temporary office trailer. A stack of blueprints sat on the desk, each detailing a phase of the hotel's construction. He idly flipped through them, scanning the designs without much thought. But as he reached the bottom of the pile, his hand brushed against something unusual. An older, yellowed blueprint. Unrolling it, he saw it depicted the same construction site, but with one glaring difference. The layout was completely different. There were corridors and rooms that didn't exist on the current plans, and most unsettlingly, a large underground basement that wasn't mentioned anywhere in the official documents. Eric's curiosity piqued. The blueprint wasn't marked with any company logos or signatures. It looked hand-drawn, with faded ink and cryptic annotations scrawled in the margins. A note at the bottom caught his attention. Never complete. Never disturbed. His radio crackled to life, jolting him from his thoughts. "Eric, status check," the site manager's gruff voice barked. "Everything's fine," Eric replied, though he couldn't shake the unease creeping into his chest. He stuffed the blueprint into his pocket, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into the night. Following the old blueprint, he began to explore. The map led him to corners of the construction site he'd never visited, areas that were supposed to be sealed off or underdeveloped. But as he walked, he began to notice strange details. Walls had faint, unexplainable markings, like scratch marks. Staircases led to nowhere, their ends bricked up. Then, he found it. Hidden behind a stack of drywall was a heavy steel door, rusted and worn. It wasn't on any of the current blueprints, but it matched the mysterious map perfectly. Eric hesitated, his flashlight beam bouncing off the metal surface. A faint chill emanated from behind the door, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and rust. With a deep breath, Eric pulled the door open. It groaned loudly, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. He descended, each step echoing ominously. The deeper he went, the colder it became. At the bottom, he found himself in a massive, unfinished basement. The space was unsettlingly quiet. The air was heavy, almost oppressive. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water into shallow puddles on the concrete floor. In the far corners of the room, his flashlight revealed a horrifying sight. A row of crude wooden cages, each stained with dark, dried smears. Eric's breath hitched. He moved closer, heart pounding. The cages were empty, but the sight of them sent chills down his spine. As he turned to leave, the beam of his flashlight caught something on the far wall. A faded mural depicting workers toiling on a construction site. Their faces, painted in unnerving detail, seemed twisted with anguish. Suddenly, his radio crackled again, but this time, the voice was different. Distorted. Hollow. "Eric," it whispered, "you shouldn't be here." He froze, the radio slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. A sudden clang echoed through the basement. Spinning around, he pointed his flashlight toward the source of the noise. One of the cages had moved. Its door, once firmly shut, now swung open. Panic surged. He sprinted back toward the stairs, but when he reached the spot where the door should have been, it was gone. In its place was a solid concrete wall. The air grew colder still, and faint whispers began to echo around him, growing louder with each passing moment. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. Then another. They began to multiply, shapes that seemed to slither along the walls, growing darker and larger. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, gaunt, and dressed in an old construction uniform. Its face was pale, its eyes sunken and lifeless. "You've disturbed what should have been left alone," the figure intoned, its voice a guttural rasp. Eric stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping in a maddening symphony. The shadows closed in, and before Eric could scream, they enveloped him. The next morning, construction workers arrived to find the site in disarray. The steel door was welded shut, the basement lost once more. Eric's belongings were still in the trailer, but he was nowhere to be found. Rumors spread among the workers, whispers of a phantom blueprint, of ghostly figures seen in the unfinished halls of the hotel. Even after the hotel was completed, guests reported strange occurrences. At night, they claimed to hear faint scratching sounds from the walls, or to see shadowy figures in their peripheral vision. The basement was never rediscovered, but Eric's flashlight occasionally appeared in the most unexpected places, its beam still flickering, as though searching for a way out. Joe worked as the night guard at Central Station, a sprawling train hub that served as the beating heart of the city during the day. By night, it was a ghostly expanse of empty platforms, darkened corridors, and the distant echoes of the day's hustle fading into silence. Joe preferred the solitude, enjoying the stillness after years of chaos in his previous job as a beat cop. But this night would strip away every ounce of peace Joe had come to expect. The shift began like any other. Joe's flashlight swept across the deserted platforms, illuminating vending machines, rows of benches, and forgotten luggage carts. As he strolled past Platform 6, his boot scraped against something metallic. Looking down, he noticed a loose tile concealing a small metal ring embedded in the floor. "Odd," he muttered, crouching down. He pulled the ring, and with a groan of protest, a trap door lifted to reveal a rusty ladder descending into darkness. A gust of cool, stale air rushed up, carrying the scent of damp earth and mildew. Curiosity piqued, Joe grabbed his flashlight and began his descent. The ladder creaked under his weight, and the dim glow of his flashlight barely pierced the void below. His boots finally touched solid ground, and he found himself in a narrow, damp tunnel. The air was thick with moisture, and water dripped rhythmically from unseen cracks above. The walls, lined with faded posters from decades past, were cracked and stained. As he swept his flashlight along the walls, something caught his eye. Words crudely scratched into the concrete. "Turn back. They know you're here. It's too late." Joe chuckled nervously. "Kids messing around," he muttered, though his voice carried little confidence. He pressed on, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The tunnel stretched endlessly, and soon, he began noticing signs of abandonment, rusted tools, old lanterns, and discarded helmets. The deeper he ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The air seemed colder, heavier, and the walls seemed to close in. Then came the noises. At first it was a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. Joe froze, straining to locate the source. The sound grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Who's there?" Joe called out, his voice bouncing back to him. The tapping stopped. Silence engulfed the tunnel, followed by an overwhelming sense of being watched. Joe's flashlight wavered as his grip tightened. As he rounded a corner, his beam caught something. A hunched figure at the far end of the tunnel. It stood motionless, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. Joe's breath hitched as the figure began to move, dragging something metallic behind it. The sound of a rusted chain scraping against the ground sent chills down his spine. "Hey!" Joe shouted, his voice echoing down the tunnel. "This is private property! You need to leave!" The figure paused but didn't respond. Then it tilted its head, the motion unnaturally slow, and continued forward. Joe took a step back, heart hammering in his chest. Spinning around, he sprinted back toward the ladder, but the tunnel seemed longer now, twisting and stretching into a labyrinth. The whispers grew louder, now interspersed with faint laughter. When Joe finally reached the ladder, he climbed with frantic urgency, slamming the trapdoor shut above him. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his flashlight flickering weakly. Back in the station, Joe bolted to the security office. His trembling hands fumbled with the keyboard as he pulled up the surveillance footage. The live feeds showed empty platforms, the occasional rat scurrying across the tracks. But when he reviewed the footage from the hidden tunnel, his stomach dropped. There he was, descending into the darkness. As the footage played, shadowy figures emerged behind him, hunched, jerky movements that defied logic. Their glowing eyes stared directly into the camera before the feed cut to static. Joe's radio crackled, pulling his attention away. A distorted voice whispered his name, followed by a deep, guttural laugh. Then, the lights in the office flickered. The screens displayed something new, the figure from the tunnel, standing in the middle of Platform 6. It raised a hand slowly, as if beckoning him. Joe grabbed his flashlight and bolted for the exit, but as he approached the main doors, they wouldn't budge. The glass was frosted, obscuring the outside world. "Let me out!" Joe shouted, pounding on the doors. Behind him, the sound of dragging chains grew louder. He turned, and there they were, figures emerging from every shadow, their movements erratic, their faces void of emotion. He ran, weaving through the platforms, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The whispers and laughter surrounded him, coming from everywhere and nowhere. He ducked into a maintenance closet, locking the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the door. The radio crackled again. "You can't escape. You shouldn't have come." The door handle rattled violently, and the chain-dragging sound was just outside. Joe raised his flashlight, the beam illuminating a vent in the wall. The grating had been removed, and from the darkness inside, two glowing eyes stared back at him. His scream echoed through the station, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The next morning, the station manager arrived to find the office empty, the trapdoor sealed. The security footage had been wiped clean, save for one frame, Joe's pale, terrified face as he turned toward the camera, with shadowy figures closing in behind him. No one ever saw Joe again. But late at night, those working the graveyard shift swear they can hear whispers coming from beneath Platform 6. The night shift at the stadium was always quiet, almost eerily so. Tim, a security guard of 3 years, liked the solitude. It gave him time to think, to let his mind wander as he patrolled the massive, empty structure. But on this particular night, the silence felt oppressive, and the air seemed heavier than usual. Tim's route took him past the old locker room, a place long abandoned and rarely visited. It was slated for demolition soon, with the stadium undergoing renovations. As he approached, his flashlight beam caught something unusual, a locker door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside the dusty room, the scent of mildew thick in the air. The rows of lockers were rusted and battered, relics of another era. The open locker revealed an old, crumpled uniform hanging on a bent hook. The uniform was strange, faded maroon with patches of discoloration. As Tim leaned closer, his breath hitched. The discoloration wasn't from age or wear, it was blood. Dried, dark stains spread across the chest and sleeves, telling a story he couldn't quite piece together. Against his better judgment, Tim reached out and touched the fabric. The moment his fingers brushed the cloth, the world around him dissolved. Suddenly, Tim found himself standing in a brightly lit locker room, but it was bustling with life. Athletes laughed and joked, the clamor of their voices echoing off the walls. Then, the atmosphere shifted. A heated argument erupted between two players, their voices escalating into shouts. Tim tried to intervene, but no one acknowledged him. It was as if he weren't there. The argument turned violent, one man grabbing a metal bat. Tim wanted to scream as he saw the first swing connect, the sickening thud reverberating in his ears. Blood splattered across the room, painting the walls and the uniform now lying crumpled on the floor. The rest of the team watched in horrified silence before quickly cleaning the scene, stuffing the uniform into a locker. The scene faded, and Tim was back in the present, gasping for air, the uniform still in his hands. Shaken, Tim dropped the garment and stumbled out of the locker room. His heart pounded as he tried to rationalize what he'd seen. It had to be a hallucination, brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew better. Throughout the night, the visions continued. Every time he passed the old locker room, the door creaked open on its own, as if beckoning him. And each time he touched the uniform, the visions became clearer, more vivid. He saw the aftermath of the murder, the team's panic, and the cover-up that followed. He saw how the coach had ordered silence, how the police had been misled, and how the truth had been buried along with the victim. By the fourth vision, Tim could even hear the victim's voice, pleading for justice. The voice echoed in his mind, haunting and relentless. Tim decided he had to act. With trembling hands, he grabbed the uniform one last time, enduring the final and most brutal vision. He saw the location of the victim's hidden body, a shallow grave beneath the stadium's old bleachers. The vision ended with a whisper in his ear, "Bring me peace." Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, Tim called the authorities. He led them to the spot, recounting what he had seen as if it were a gut feeling. Skeptical but willing to investigate, the police dug beneath the bleachers. What they found confirmed Tim's visions, a skeleton wearing the same blood-stained uniform. The case reopened, unraveling decades of lies and exposing those who had silenced the truth. But even after the case was closed, Tim could still hear the faint echoes of the victim's voice in the stadium at night. He'd brought justice, but the spirit's presence lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had once been hidden in the heart of the stadium. And every time Tim walked past the old locker room, he felt eyes watching him, as though the past wasn't quite finished with him yet.